In November 1910, a small group of 7 men quietly boarded a private railcar in Hoboken, New Jersey, and headed south to Jekyll Island, Georgia, under a veil of deliberate secrecy. For about 10 days, those 7, who collectively represented roughly 1/4 of the planet's wealth, worked behind closed doors to draft the blueprint for what would become the Federal Reserve, a central bank for the United States that would, in practice, be controlled and owned by the same powerful banking interests it was supposed to supervise. And this was not a public commission or an open democratic process. It was a literal conspiracy in the plain meaning of the word, a covert gathering of private financiers traveling under first names only, pretending to be on a duck hunting trip, while actually writing legislation that would hand them influence over the entire American money system. And 3 years later, on December 23, 1913, while most legislators had already left Washington for Christmas, the Federal Reserve Act slipped through Congress and was signed into law, completing a project that no king, emperor, or invading army had ever managed: the effective privatization of money creation itself. What should unsettle you is that the Federal Reserve is neither truly federal nor backed by genuine reserves in the old sense. It is a banking cartel with a government-style label, and in the more than 111 years since the discussions at Jekyll Island, Congress has never subjected it to a full, unrestricted audit, meaning that the structure forged by those 7 men still shapes every dollar in your pocket, every savings account you hold, and the economic future of the country today. So to understand who really pulls the levers of money and credit, you have to go back not just to Jekyll Island itself, but to the crisis that made it politically possible, the Panic of 1907. In October of that year, the stock market plunged. A wave of bank failures spread from New York across the nation. Depositors rushed branches in terror, and runs broke out from coast to coast, with the entire financial system teetering on collapse. At that time, the United States had no central bank. Because earlier experiments with such institutions had been abandoned, the first Bank of the United States, created in 1791, had expired in 1811. The Second Bank of the United States was chartered in 1816 and then crushed by President Andrew Jackson in 1836, who denounced it as a dangerous engine of control and warned that if such a bank were allowed to endure, the American people would one day find themselves dominated by money power rather than representative government. And for about 77 years after Jackson's victory, the country functioned without a central bank at all, relying on private institutions and ad hoc measures, which meant that when panic struck in 1907, there was no official lender of last resort to flood the system with liquidity, and the only person able to stop the collapse was John Pierpont Morgan, the formidable head of J.P. Morgan and Company. Morgan locked the top bankers in his library, pressured them into pooling funds, and used his personal clout and capital to choreograph a private bailout, which did arrest the crisis. But he did so in a way that sent a clear message. The country needed a central bank, and the men who should run it were the bankers themselves. The panic destroyed more than 25 banks and trust companies, sent shares down roughly 50%, and cost many ordinary people their savings and jobs. But Morgan emerged even more dominant, having proven that private financiers could manage the money supply in a way the government could not, at least in the narrative they promoted afterward. In 1908, Congress reacted by passing the Aldrich-Vreeland Act, which created a National Monetary Commission to study banking reform and recommend a framework to prevent future panics. The commission's chair was Senator Nelson Aldrich, a powerful Republican from Rhode Island, deeply tied to Wall Street, a business ally of J.P. Morgan, and the father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller Jr., so the man charged with studying reform already stood at the center of the same financial network that had just bailed out the country. And although the commission was supposed to travel abroad, examine European monetary systems, and craft neutral recommendations, what it actually delivered was political cover for bankers to design their own system, out of sight, on private property. On the night of November 22, 1910, 7 selected figures boarded a discreet private rail car at Hoboken. They were told to bring no personal staff, to arrive separately, and to avoid using their surnames, referring to one another only by first name or pseudonym, to throw off any curious reporters or other passengers. For if the press discovered that the most powerful bankers in America were sneaking away together to draft banking legislation, public outrage would have torpedoed the project instantly, because ordinary Americans at that time loathed the big New York banks, resented J.P. Morgan, and distrusted Wall Street. So the men hid their real purpose behind the cover story of a simple hunting excursion. Their train rolled nearly 1,000 miles south to the private Jekyll Island Club off the Georgia coast, a retreat owned by a small circle of families, including the Morgans, Rockefellers, Vanderbilts, and Goulds, making it the perfect secure setting. Remote, exclusive, accessible only to members and their guests, and easy to lock down from prying eyes. Inside its walls, approximately $600 billion of 1910-era wealth, equivalent to roughly $20 trillion in modern terms, sat around the same table, a concentration of financial power representing about 1/4 of global wealth. The participants formed a who's who of high finance. Senator Nelson Aldrich was the political spearhead, chairing the National Monetary Commission, and yet personally invested across banking, sugar, rubber, and railroads, and through his daughter's marriage to John D. Rockefeller Jr., he would become the grandfather of future power brokers like Nelson Rockefeller, governor of New York, and later vice president under Gerald Ford. Aldrich's mission at Jekyll Island was to shepherd whatever the bankers produced through Congress and package it as neutral reform rather than as a self-serving move by the money trust. Frank Vanderlip, president of National City Bank of New York, represented the Rockefeller banking empire, his institution being the forerunner of today's Citibank. He would later openly acknowledge in his memoirs that their secret journey to Jekyll Island was the true birthplace of the Federal Reserve System, and that secrecy was essential because admitting that such a small clique of bankers had written the bill would have doomed it in the legislature. Paul Warburg, a partner at Lowe and Company and a member of the influential Warburg banking family of Hamburg and Frankfurt, brought detailed knowledge of European central banks, such as the Bank of England, the Reichsbank, and the Bank of France, and served as the intellectual engineer of the new system, explaining how a central bank could issue currency, adjust interest rates, and quietly benefit private financiers while being sold to the public as a stabilizing institution. Benjamin Strong, head of Bankers Trust and a key lieutenant of J.P. Morgan, attended to safeguard Morgan interests and would later become the first governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the most powerful post in the system, which he held for roughly 14 years until his death in 1928. Henry Davison, another senior J.P. Morgan partner, handled coordination and kept the various factions aligned. Charles Norton, president of First National Bank of New York, represented another Rockefeller-connected bank that would eventually merge into what became Citi, and Piet Andrew, assistant secretary of the Treasury under President Taft and a member of the National Monetary Commission, served as the link to the federal government, lending an official sheen to a meeting that was otherwise purely private. After the legislation was in place, he left government service and went on to work on behalf of the very banking interests he had convened with on Jekyll Island. For about 10 days the 7 men controlled the entire club, with minimal staff and complete privacy, and their task was not just to sketch a new institution, but to solve 3 political problems cleverly enough that the public and most politicians would not realize what had been done. First, Americans historically detested the concept of a central bank, with the memory of Andrew Jackson's fight against the second bank still echoing, so any bill explicitly creating a central bank of the United States would have been dead on arrival. The solution was branding to avoid the phrase central bank entirely, and instead coin the name Federal Reserve System, a label that sounded governmental and reassuring, with the word federal suggesting public ownership and the word reserve implying prudence and backing, even though both associations would be misleading. Second, citizens outside New York hated the idea of more power for Wall Street, and outright domination by New York banks would spark regional resistance. So the designers invented a network of regional reserve banks scattered across the country, giving the illusion of decentralization and local control, while in practice concentrating the real power in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, where Wall Street institutions would dominate policy. Third, they had to keep the institution insulated from direct democratic control while still securing government support. Truly public control might subject it to the electorate and reduce its usefulness to bankers. So they structured it as a system of privately owned regional banks whose stock would be held by commercial member banks, which would elect most of the boards, while a small number of directors and the central board in Washington would be nominally appointed by government officials, thereby allowing insiders to run daily operations while still enjoying the backing and legal privileges of a government entity. The result was an elegant design from their standpoint, an institution that could issue currency, create credit, and support banks, wrapped in a public-sounding name, but owned and steered by the very firms it would serve. The mechanics of money creation changed fundamentally once this structure was in place. Previously, money had ultimately been tied to gold and silver, with paper notes serving as claims that could theoretically be redeemed for a fixed weight of precious metal, and banks were constrained by their reserves. Under the new architecture, the government could finance spending by issuing interest-bearing bonds rather than raising sufficient taxes, and the Federal Reserve could buy those bonds by conjuring new dollars into existence, first as entries in ledgers and later as electronic balances, exchanging that newly created money for government IOUs. The government then spent those dollars into the economy on salaries, projects, weapons, and social programs, while taxpayers were on the hook to pay interest on the bonds. That interest was funded by taxes collected from workers and businesses, while the Federal Reserve and its member banks earned returns on the securities they held, effectively charging society interest on money fabricated out of nothing. Member banks were required to hold stock in their regional Federal Reserve Bank and received a guaranteed dividend of about 6% on that stock, funded from the Fed's earnings, which largely derived from interest on the government debt it held, which was ultimately supported by the tax base. In simple terms, the architecture ensured that when the government wanted to spend more than it collected, it would borrow from a central institution that could print the money, and citizens would pay interest to that institution's owners in perpetuity. After the Jackal Island gathering produced a model, the political campaign began. Senator Aldrich first advanced the design under his own name as the Aldrich Plan in 1912, but because he was widely regarded as a servant of big finance, the proposal went nowhere in a Democratic House that viewed it as a banker power grab. The strategy shifted to rebranding the bill, reframing it as a progressive reform to restrain the money trust rather than empower it. In the presidential election of 1912, Woodrow Wilson campaigned as a Democrat who criticized Wall Street concentration, yet his campaign was short of funds and quietly received support, advice, and connections from bankers linked to the Jackal Island Circle, including through figures like Paul Warburg and the shadowy political advisor Colonel Edward House, who soon became Wilson's closest confidant inside the White House and an advocate for the Federal Reserve Project. Under the guidance of these insiders, the Jackal Island Plan was repackaged as the Federal Reserve Act and championed by Democratic legislators such as Carter Glass and Robert Owen as the fix to the Panic of 1907. In reality, the core structure designed by the bankers remained intact. The timing of the final vote was telling. Congress was about to recess for Christmas in December 1913. Many representatives and senators had already arranged to leave Washington, and at the last moment party leaders held the chambers in session long enough to push the voluminous 1,000-plus page bill through, with the House approving it by a wide margin and the Senate passing it by 43 votes to 2 on December 23rd, while numerous members were absent. President Wilson signed it into law that same day, just before the holiday, locking in the new central bank barely 3 years after the Jackal Island trip. A few lawmakers understood the scale of what had been done. Representative Charles Lindbergh Sr. of Minnesota warned that the act legalized an invisible government of money power and called it one of the greatest legislative crimes in history. But his protests were drowned out, and the new system opened its doors on November 16, 1914, with Benjamin Strong taking command of the New York Fed and Paul Warburg seated on the Federal Reserve Board. Almost immediately, the institution revealed why the architects had wanted it. Within months, Europe was engulfed in World War I, and although the Federal Reserve's creation and the war's outbreak were not necessarily coordinated, the timing was extremely convenient for those who wanted to finance conflict without immediately raising taxes. When the United States entered the war, the Fed purchased large quantities of war bonds by creating new money, helping to more than double the money supply by roughly $25 billion and enabling the government to spend dramatically beyond its tax revenues, while banks earned interest on the bonds, underwrote arms contracts, and J.P. Morgan's firm became the exclusive purchasing agent for Britain and France in America, earning commissions on massive orders. After the war, the Fed kept credit cheap and interest rates low throughout much of the 1920s, fueling a stock market boom driven by borrowed money. Benjamin Strong explicitly favored easy money despite warnings about speculation, because tighter credit would have choked off the rise that was enriching bankers and their clients. When the market crashed in 1929 and the Great Depression followed, the Federal Reserve, which had been sold as the mechanism that would prevent such panics, presided over a contraction of the money supply by roughly one-third, allowing thousands of small banks and businesses to fail, while larger institutions survived and used the wreckage to acquire rivals at bargain prices. The Fed had failed in its stated public mission, but had not failed the big banks who owned stock in the system. The pattern repeated in World War II, when the Federal Reserve again financed an enormous expansion of government debt, with obligations swelling from about $40 billion to more than $260 billion, again by monetizing Treasury securities and generating profits for bondholders and financial intermediaries, while inflation and later taxes eroded the purchasing power of ordinary citizens. In 1971, President Richard Nixon severed the last formal link between the dollar and gold, ending convertibility and turning the dollar into a pure fiat currency, backed only by government decree and the Federal Reserve's ability to create and manage supply. With no gold constraint, there was no theoretical limit on how many dollars could be produced. In the crisis of 2008, when banks collapsed under the weight of their own reckless bets on mortgage securities, the Federal Reserve expanded its balance sheet by roughly $4.5 trillion over the following years through programs nicknamed quantitative easing, buying toxic assets, and providing emergency loans to financial institutions, ensuring that none of the largest banks failed and no senior executive went to prison. Even as around 10 million Americans lost homes to foreclosure, unemployment climbed to around 10%, and middle-class wealth fell sharply. The banks that were integrated into the Fed system were made whole, while taxpayers and borrowers absorbed the pain. In early 2020, when the pandemic triggered another market meltdown, the Fed created roughly $4 trillion in a matter of months, buying government bonds, corporate bonds, and even lower-grade debt, and offering essentially unlimited credit lines to banks at near-zero interest, which helped drive stock indexes to new highs and boosted the net worth of billionaires by around $1.8 trillion, while tens of millions of workers filed for unemployment and countless small businesses shut their doors. Again, the new money flowed first to financial markets and large institutions, with ordinary people catching only the diluted after-effects in the form of stimulus checks, and, soon after, sharply higher prices. By 2021, inflation had surged to about 9%, the highest in 4 decades, and the response of the Federal Reserve was to raise interest rates, a move that punishes borrowers, pressures employment, and risks recession, but generally allows banks to charge more for loans. Ordinary households pay more for mortgages, car loans, and credit card debt, while receiving modest or delayed relief in their wages. Over the century plus since the Federal Reserve's birth, the cumulative effect of continual money creation and inflation targeting has been enormous. The United States dollar has lost roughly 98% of its purchasing power since 1913, so that what $1 bought then would now require around $32, meaning that lifelong savers see their stored labor steadily eroded, while the banks that benefit from being closest to the source of new money harvest the gains. The member banks that hold stock in the Federal Reserve Banks and elect most of their directors include giants such as J.P. Morgan Chase, Citibank, Bank of America, and Wells Fargo, direct descendants or close relatives of the institutions represented on Jekyll Island. They own the regional banks as private corporations, receive guaranteed dividends before any surplus is remitted to the Treasury, and exert powerful influence over policy, especially through the New York Fed. The Federal Reserve calls itself independent, by which it means independent of day-to-day political control by Congress, but it is not independent of the banking system that literally owns it. At the same time, it has largely evaded serious scrutiny, because every attempt by lawmakers such as Ron Paul or Bernie Sanders to authorize a full audit of its books and emergency programs has been blocked or watered down. Even without a complete audit, we know from court cases and limited disclosures that during the 2008 crisis, the Fed quietly extended around $29 trillion in cumulative loans and guarantees to various domestic and foreign banks and institutions, much of it in secrecy, exposed only after legal challenges. And we know that the central bank's meetings are closed to the public. Its complex dealings with foreign central banks and global institutions are only partially disclosed, and its internal ownership structure remains opaque to most citizens. The 7 men who traveled incognito to Jekyll Island in November 1910 thus succeeded beyond even their own expectations. They created a hybrid creature, a private central bank with public backing, and enormous, largely unchecked power to create money, set interest rates, and redistribute wealth through inflation and credit cycles, and they did it in such a way that the public would not understand the mechanism even as it affected every paycheck and every loan. They chose a patriotic-sounding name, moved the key vote onto December 23rd, when many lawmakers were absent and the nation was thinking about holidays rather than monetary architecture, and locked in a design that has, over more than 111 years, transferred trillions of dollars in value from workers and savers to banks and asset holders. Today, every dollar you earn is a Federal Reserve note issued by that system. You are compelled to pay taxes in those notes, and you watch their purchasing power decline by a deliberate 2% or so each year as the Fed targets positive inflation, effectively imposing a slow annual tax on cash savings and wages while rewarding those who own assets that rise with the tide of newly created money. Every financial crisis becomes an opportunity to justify extraordinary interventions that rescue the largest institutions first, and every bailout is funded by expanding the money supply, which later shows up in the form of higher prices for food, energy, and housing. Frank Vanderlip once admitted that if the public in 1910 had discovered that a small group of bankers had secretly written the banking bill, it never would have passed, and he was almost certainly correct. But secrecy, misdirection, and clever branding carried the day, and the creature from Jackal Island, as later critics would call it, is not some historical ghost. It is the living framework of the modern money system, still drawing strength from every dollar of debt, every note printed, every bond issued, and every crisis it helps to magnify and then solve.